Thank you for watching this video from the Center for European Studies at Carleton University. This project has received funding from the European Union and Carleton University. The views expressed in this video do not reflect those of the European Union or the Center for European Studies. Hi, I'm Merrick Eby with the Center for European Studies at Carleton University, and I'm joined today by Dr. Michael Johns. He is the chair of the Political Science Department at Laurentian University, and also the Vice Dean of Arts at the Barrie Campus. Dr. Johns has been at Carleton University today to give a lecture on issues of intra-EU migration and social cohesion in the European Union. So thank you for joining me today, Dr. Johns.
Thank you.
One of the big issues, I guess, in this whole debate over migration in the EU has been Eastern expansion, the expansion of 2004, the expansion of 2007. And really, you know, in the lead up to those expansions, there was this huge fear that there'd be just a massive influx of immigrants from Eastern European former countries of the Soviet bloc. Could you maybe just elaborate on what the reality of that expansion has been and, you know, what actually happened as opposed to the fears that were expressed before the accession?
Sure. Before the accession process, there was some quite wild predictions that huge numbers of people were going to flood out of Central and Eastern Europe and do it almost immediately. And into some of the countries such as Germany and Austria, that the numbers were incredibly high. Because there were restrictions, the EU allowed restrictions on EU migration at a state-by-state basis for up to 7 years, you end up with a very different reality that really there's only 3 places early on that the East Europeans and Central Europeans could go. And that would be Sweden, where you don't see a huge number of people moving, and then into Ireland and Britain. And there, because it was condensed, it does look like there's a huge number of people. If they had been spread across all of the member states of the European Union, the West European states, at the time, it wouldn't have seemed like such a huge number. But because they were limited in where they could go, you do end up having hundreds of thousands of people move into Ireland. You have even more people moving into Britain. And so some of those fears become self-fulfilling because you then funnel the options for the intra-EU migrants from Central and Eastern Europe into a very small number of locations. What was interesting is what happened afterwards, is that those countries actually benefited economically. They needed the migrants. The migrants were taking jobs, were paying taxes, were helping those societies. And the countries that had put restrictions on particularly the first group, the A8, the 8 East European and Central European countries, they start dropping them early. That the 7-year period, they never actually get to those 7 years before they drop the restrictions and try to benefit from having some of these highly skilled East Europeans move into their country. The A2, the Bulgaria and Romania that come in 2007, it has been somewhat different. The British government, which had been very welcoming to the A8, has been very restrictive on the A2. This group, the A2, the Bulgarians and Romanians, and in particular the Roma population coming out of both of those countries, but in particular Romania, have led to much more of a concern about the numbers that are moving and the realities economically that they cause the states where they move to. That there hasn't been the economic benefit of the A2 that we saw with the A8 early on in Ireland and Britain, and then across the rest of the Western states as they drop their restrictions.
What have the political or social impacts of this immigration been? You know, across Western Europe and the EU in general, perhaps we've seen a rise in anti-immigrant or anti-migrant sentiment, the rise of extreme right parties in a lot of cases as well. What role or how has intra-EU migration played into this sort of more general trend in relation to immigration?
It's certainly a part of it. That, most of the attention is placed, and quite rightly so, on some of the growing resentment about Muslim immigrants coming from outside of the EU, and certainly the protests that you see in Germany and elsewhere are very directed at immigrants But what is interesting is that they're directed at immigrants generally. And the intra-EU migrants, they are part of that discussion. So if you're a xenophobic right-wing person, you're not going to make that much of a difference between someone who has moved from outside of the EU and someone who has moved from inside the EU. They're all outsiders. They are all there to take jobs. They are all of the rhetoric that is used about one group of immigrants is used on another. Where the intra-EU migrants are interesting is that they have moved into places where we haven't seen traditional immigrants move, where traditional immigrants tend to move into cities. They tend to move in and around the capital cities or the major cities, while the intra-EU migrants also moved there, where you see large numbers of Poles moving into Ealing Broadway in London, for example, or the community outside of London like Slough or even Edinburgh. They also moved into small places where immigrants don't normally move to. And so these smaller societies, these small towns and these rural areas now have intra-EU migrants in their region, which they would not have traditional immigrants. And so while if you look at it as the aggregate, countries are the right-wing movements, the xenophobic movements, the anti-immigrant movements, maybe on a national level using the Muslims or people from North Africa or others as being their poster children of the problem as they would see it. In other places, it is actually Poles or Latvians or Lithuanians, and how those groups have been integrated into those societies and whether they have faced discrimination or in some cases violence really dictates the nature of those regions and their response to immigration. For them, immigration is intra-EU migration, where in larger urban centers, it's something that comprises both intra-EU and outside EU migration.